Go live to Zoom.
Okay.
Just as we're doing that, directors, I'd like to, through you, Mr. Chair, I'd like to just say thank you to all of you for getting the budget through and for bringing that to the table and marshaling it. I apologize I couldn't be there that evening for the vote. I think you all know why I wasn't there, so I won't go into that, but I do appreciate it. And thank you for everything.
So to follow up on that, the deputy mayor of the city of Fredericton is still on the naughty list in Harvey.
He's on the naughty list in Central York too.
Okay.
Oh, well, I think we should get to our business, though.
All right. So we'll call the meeting to order and I'll ask for an approval of the agenda.
I'll approve that. All right.
Seconder?
Yeah.
Seconder?
Seconded, David.
Okay. The movement is seconded. Ready to question? All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carried. We have an agenda. Mary Kay, year-end projections, or John, I'm not sure. I guess Mary Kay. Yes, excuse me. First of all, any conflict of interest? Okay. Year-end projections and recommended reserve fund transfers. Mary Kay, want to lead us through that process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to take a moment and share my screen here. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so just by way of background, the Regional Service Delivery Act specifies that a service commission may establish and manage reserve funds in relation to a service that it provides. So there's two types of reserve funds that we can have. The first is operating reserve funds, which can only be used for payment of operating expenses. And the second one is a capital reserve fund, which can only be used for payment of capital purchases. You cannot use one for the other. And each fund can have its own reserve funds to be used solely for that purpose. So what I mean by that is you cannot use solid waste reserve funds to pay for, say, planning and development expenses or vice versa. They are self-contained and they have to be used for the purpose in which they are established. Any transfers that go to a reserve fund or come from a reserve fund have to be done by board resolution prior to December 31st of that year. So that's why we're meeting mid-December. We like to have as much information as possible before we finalize projections and make any recommendations to the Finance Committee for forwarding on to the board. So the simple way to look at reserve funds is they're really a savings account. They're set aside for items that may come up that were unplanned, unexpected, whether they're operating in nature or capital in nature. So that's why it's important, depending on which service line you're looking at, to have both and for them to be adequately funded. And adequately funded reserves really are good financial management. Just like in your personal finances, it's important to have savings accounts set aside for something that comes up that you didn't anticipate. The same is said for the commission. The Capital Region Service Commission does have a policy with regard to the level of reserve funds it maintains. In full disclosure, it's a number of years old, so it is something that the Finance Committee should be looking at in the near future to bring it up to date for the new services that we are providing, as well as to look at the amounts that have been established, because since COVID and the inflation that's resulted, probably the levels that are in that reserve fund are not enough for what we need in 2024 and going forward. So I'm going to take you through projections of where we expect to finish the year of 2023 at, and go through the recommended reserve fund transfers. So all of the transfers that we're recommending this year are transfers to a reserve fund. So we're putting the money aside. We are not recommending removing any money from the reserve funds at this time. So the first fund that we're going to look at is our planning and development services. And there's no surprises here. When we've reviewed the financials on a quarterly basis, we've talked about we have expected to have a surplus in planning and development. That is being driven by lower than budgeted salaries and benefits. So when we look here, we can see, I'll just go through how it's laid out. The first column is the annual budget for 2023. The actual as of November is our actual revenues and expenses from January to November. The projection is what we expect to earn and expect to spend in December. These two columns added together give you our projection for 2023. So that's the column that we're really going to focus on. And then you can see the difference from where we project to be versus what we had budgeted. So for revenues, we're expecting to be fairly on budget, within $1,200 of what we had budgeted for 2023. The surplus is being driven by savings in the expenses, particularly the salaries and benefits, when we had a couple of vacant positions during the year. So for that reason, and those expense savings, staff is recommending a transfer to the Planning and Development Operating Reserve Fund of $15,000. So that means that would get expensed in 2023 in the operating fund, and we would transfer that money over to the operating reserve fund. That net result would be an estimated surplus at the end of 2023 of just over $63,000. Keeping in mind, these are projections. They're not going to be exactly bang on with the actuals, but it's a rough estimate, and it should be fairly close. So transferring $15,000 to our operating reserve fund would produce a balance of $25,000 in that operating reserve fund after that transfer, which is consistent with our reserve fund policy and the level that we try to maintain there. As you can expect, planning and development is service-based, so there's not a major need for capital reserves. Operating reserves is what makes sense for planning and development. Are there any questions on this one before I move to the next one?
Any questions? I have one if no one else does. So is this operating reserve fund controlled at the same level that a municipal operating reserve fund would be? So the 5%, and does the 5% go across our total budget or just within the operating business lines of operating that we're putting those funds into?
Excellent question. At one point it was driven by 5%. They have removed that. So we do not have a maximum amount that we can contribute to the operating reserve fund anymore.
All right, thank you.
But other than that cap that municipalities have, the reserve funds are exactly the same between municipalities and regional service commissions.
So I do have one other question because of the issue of cash flow. Are the operating reserves funds put into dedicated accounts within the bank or in the bank?
They absolutely are. They're all segregated. And when it gets to a certain level, we do invest those in GICs. So they're all segregated and they're all tracked separately with their own accounts. Sometimes we pool the money and put them in a GIC, they flow back and we allocate the interest accordingly.
So that just gives us, if it was ever needed, a little bit more of a buffer in January, February, and March when the cash flow is a little limited and the expenses are high.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Any questions, committee?
Right.
Thank you.
So the next fund is the Solid Waste Services Fund. So as you know, it's broken down by landfill and recycling. So this is just a summary page, and we'll get into the details on the next page. But what you'll see here is landfill, no surprise, it has a surplus. Recycling has a deficit, as you would expect. And adding the two of them together, we are projecting to have a surplus of a little over $500,000 for the year after we consider the recommended reserve fund transfers. So for the landfill, we are seeing much higher revenues, particularly in the garbage. So for 2023, we had budgeted 81,000 tons. we're projecting to be almost at 86,000 tons when 2023 is completed. So that's higher tonnage than we've ever seen. So it's a good problem to have from a point of view of revenue. And so that's what's leading to this 493,000 difference. The other area that revenues are higher in is our other income, and particularly relating to our elm tree tonnage. So when elm tree brings in soil to remediate, they pay us a fee for each ton. So when they do big projects, we benefit. So that's what's driving that other income. In our 2023 budget, we had included 500,000 to be withdrawn from the capital reserve, and that was going to be used to pay for our baler chain and our baling facility. Because of the higher revenue and the lower expenses in 2023, we do not need to take an amount out of the reserve fund. We are able to fund those costs from our operating funds. And the baler chain work is not all going to be completed in 2023. So there's some work that's going to be done in 2024. So we will have to look at 2024 when that work is completed and the costs in 2024 are known, whether we will have to take some money out of the reserve fund in order to cover that 2024 portion of the baler chain expenses. But as of 2023, no reserve fund transfer out of the reserve fund is needed. So on the expense side of things, there's two main expenses where we've realized savings. The first is salaries and benefits, which we've talked about. And then the other area is the post-closing costs. And we've talked about that a little bit too. Because of our EIA and the extended life of the landfill, we did not need to transfer as much over to our investments on a monthly basis. So that resulted in savings of about 270,000. We also had some sales of investments. So we sold and we reinvested those funds, which meant we had realized gains. So instead of an expense in post-closing costs, we actually had income that came in through those actual realized gains. So where we expected to spend 283,000, we actually made 253,000. So that is driving a large portion. And that's really just an accounting transaction, but it still does benefit the bottom line. So what that means with the additional revenue and the savings on the expense side, we are able to transfer some money into reserve funds. So the original budget called for a transfer of 50,000 to the operating reserve, and then just under 34,000 as a transfer to our power generation operating facility because we had to balance that budget. Power generation has significantly outperformed the budget. It does not require this transfer, but we're recommending to still do the 50,000 to the operating reserve. And then we're recommending to put an additional 500,000 into our capital reserve because we have the funds there in the operating fund. So rather than just leave them and let them flow through as a surplus, we're going to be strategic about it and put it away to be used at the board's discretion in the future. So with all that in mind, we are projecting for the landfill to have a surplus of 1.4 million at the end of 2023, which is significantly higher than what we had expected of 1,054,000. So the landfill subsidizes the recycling facility. So for our sales on recycling, we're going to be pretty close to budget, probably within about 40,000. And then we have some savings on the expense side, again, on the salaries and benefits line. So that's resulted in a less of a deficit than what we had budgeted. So we had budgeted $1,054,000. We're projecting to be about 911,000, which is about 144,000 higher, better off than we had expected to be. So if you add the landfill surplus of the 1.4 million to the deficit of 910, that's where you arrive at that projected surplus for 2023 of 501,000. So the two reserve fund transfers that are recommended is the 50,000 to the operating reserve. That would produce a balance in the operating reserve for solid waste of 480,000. And in the capital reserve, the transfer of 500,000 would produce a balance of 2,590,000. As you can imagine, the landfill is very capital intensive. So it makes sense for the majority of our reserve funds to be in there because we can use those reserve funds for unanticipated failures and pieces of equipment, or to fund future cell development as well, and allows us to maintain a steady and predictable tipping fee going forward. Any questions on the solid waste before I move on?
I get one. It appears, and maybe I'm wrong, but I guess I don't understand the recycling costs being low, and then the landfill prices being high, and then saying that we're going to constantly subsidize one with the other. Why are we not saying this is the rate and this will be the loss, and then just determine where it falls?
That's a great question. I might let Brett chime in here, but the idea is we've never charged for recycling materials coming across our scale. And the reason is it would promote more people to recycle if they can bring it here at no cost, rather than having to pay a tipping fee like they would for their garbage. Brett, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair, I think you expressed it well, Mary Kay. It's a financial incentive, Mayor Nicklin. It's a economic incentive to encourage people to divert, and it's standard practice in the business to waive tipping fees associated with diversion programs, and make up for them on the solid waste side. So the other thing I would note, I think that's going to become less relevant going forward with the introduction of the extended producer responsibility program for that'll cover the vast majority of residential recycling in the region. Yeah, it's an economic incentive to encourage people to divert.
So if you would assume then that the recycling program would be quite labor intensive within the area of the facility, versus if you looked at my area all the way from Harcourt, probably nobody's recycling back to Fredericton on that cost. And then if it doesn't become as relevant, are we going to look down the road at the landfill standing on its own, so that these costs that are extended out to everybody, we're not going to be looking at these $2 increases and whatnot?
Well, if again, through you, Mr. Chair, I would suggest, I don't see a world where we start charging tipping fees on recycling. To be clear, tipping fees, the cost of recycling is significantly higher than landfilling the material. That's absolutely the case, but I don't foresee a world where we start charging to recycle. Short of board direction to do that, but that would be a significant departure from the way things have been done for since the inception of the recycling programs in the early 2000s.
Right, but is it broke down by region? Like what regions are bringing in the recycle? Like everywhere else, we can see, like on garbage pickup, we see who's bringing in what and how much it's costing you. Is it recycling done the exact same?
Yeah, it typically it is to a point. And when I say to a point, the recycling differs from garbage collection, and that's what makes it trackable, right? In one key way, we administer currently a region-wide recycling contract on behalf of all of the communities, save the city of Fredericton, village of New Maryland, rural community of Hanwell, and the town of Oromocto. In all of the other cases, all of the other communities are served by blanket contract administered by the RSC. In order to realize some of those efficiencies, we have overlapping collection routes that may incorporate more than one community on any given day. The idea there is that we're filling the trucks to capacity and really maximizing the program costs that way. So in most cases, yes, we can track by community. But in some smaller communities, you know, like the former community of Millville, for example, wasn't large enough to warrant a specific collection route, and so those numbers would be blended in with Nakoik. So as far as trackability by community, yeah, we do have an insight into that. We don't have the exact numbers for each individual community. We can't, you know, unscramble the egg, so to speak, once it's all in the truck.
But you could show a ballpark, is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I wouldn't mind seeing that myself.
We will get that for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Okay, so I have one, Brett, I guess, Mary Kay, not so much on the financial side, but I think it's critical that we understand this operation as we make these decisions. So circular materials coming into place in May. We, as communities, will not be recycling or not be in control of, in most cases, unless they've elected to join in, of the recycling model. We should not have any cost for recycling at that point that I'm aware of. So, and the commitment from Circular Materials at this point seems to be to continue the recycling model that communities had in place. We'll see how that works. But so yeah, the material that Circular Materials are going to be gathering up for recycling, they will be paying for disposal of that somewhere. I certainly wouldn't expect that they'd be getting that they would get a free ride into our recycling, I guess, wouldn't anticipate that anyway. So at that point, what we're talking about is the recycling that doesn't get picked up by Circular Materials and delivered into their model. So I'm wondering where that would even come from after May.
Well, I'll do my best to answer those questions, Mayor Corey. So if I can go back quickly, you know, one item that Mayor Nicklin had asked about recycling was about how those tonnages are allocated by community. I think it's important to note that half of the tonnage that flows through our facility are non-residential tons. We've got separate contracts on those, and some of those commercial baling contracts, for example, on commercial cardboard, that helps. You know, the profitability of those contracts helps offset some of the costs that we incur on the recycling side. To your questions, Mayor Corey, Circular Materials and the Extended Producer Responsibility Program that's being rolled out in New Brunswick, as you said, effective May 1st. If communities haven't opted in, to be clear, all communities in our region opted out. So it essentially, it'll come in for everybody on May 1st. There are two components to that, one the collection side, one on the processing side. You're correct. From the municipal perspective, effective May 1st, municipalities will no longer have any costs associated with the collection of that material. Now, the way it works on the processing side, and I should say, that was the real benefit of a program like this. That's the only tangible benefit, is that it was really effective at eliminating collection costs, which are the bulk of costs associated with recycling. It eliminates those from the books of the municipalities. So it works great that way. Processing, I think it's fair to characterize it as an afterthought in this entire process. We're going to be in a position where we have to bid on the processing of the new residential material. Where most municipalities didn't have a capital investment, for the most part, I believe in our region, that was all contracted out. It's as simple as wiping their hands of the contract and walking away from it. On the processing side, we've got a significant investment in place. We've got a facility that's worth, millions of dollars. We have staff there with benefits, all of that. So, I mean, I think we've got about 16, 15 staff working in that facility right now. And so we're going to put in a bid. We haven't come to an agreement on that. Even in the absence of an agreement, let's hypothetically, if in the scenario where we bid a price, Circular Materials said, you know what, we're not interested, we're going to take it somewhere else for processing. We're still stuck with that 50% residual that comes from commercial, and we have to figure out what we're going to do about that. Do we stop that altogether? Some of that commercial material, for example, we do school recycling programs. We're out to the schools in Harvey, for example, picking up. That's part of this. That's part of that sort of commercial, industrial, commercial, institutional. It all gets lumped up into one group in the solid waste world. So you've got all these fixed costs, and all of a sudden what you've essentially got, if you don't get the contract, is 50% reduction in revenues. You can see how a scenario like that would result in actually higher per unit costs. Your total cost may go down, but your higher cost per ton may actually sort of come into play, right? So it's a balancing act, and we haven't, that's a long-winded answer to say that we haven't reached an agreement with Circular Materials at this point, and so it's hard to say what the exact impact is on the cost of recycling going forward from the processing perspective.
For clarity, your commercial clients pay a recycling fee when they come across the scales. They pay a tonnage fee for recycling the commercial.
That's correct. Yeah, it's a baling fee that we would charge them on the commercial baling contracts. On the schools, hospitals, universities, government offices, small businesses, and all of the communities within the region, they do not pay a fee. That is offered free of charge. It always has been since, you know, I believe that program came into effect in 2001, possibly the late 90s, 1998. But yeah, we've never charged a fee on those, but we do on the commercial baling contracts that we hold with. I shouldn't say the exact companies possibly, but you know, they would include like Sobeys. It's on behalf of Scotia Recycling.
Right, so we can move on here, Mary Kay, but this discussion, of course, has nothing to do with the capital reserves that are on our budget, but I think we have to note that in a future finance committee meeting, we need to bring this topic back up on the table so we get more depth in the understanding of that going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the next fund that we'll look at is power generation. And as I mentioned, power generation has had one of its most successful years to date in 2023. So that is the good news. Revenue is projected to be about $228,000 higher than what was budgeted. In other revenue, we received $146,000 for a core charge, and that was for the replacement of our engine from 2022. And we weren't sure if we were going to receive that, but the good news is we did. So that's some additional funds that have come in. As I mentioned, we were originally thinking we would have to take money from the solid waste operating to subsidize power generation. That was not the case because of the outperformance in the revenues of power generation. So on the expense side of things, we did see maintenance costs, and that's maintenance with regard to the engines. Those were higher than budgeted, but was more than subsidized by the additional revenue coming in. So what we are recommending for power generation is to transfer $150,000 of the operating surplus to the power generation capital reserve fund. That would leave a projected surplus in power generation operating fund of just under $44,000, and it would produce a balance in the power generation capital reserve fund of $191,000. Now, the idea behind the capital reserve fund for power generation is to build that fund up so that when the engines need to be replaced, we are able to pay for the majority of that replacement out of the reserve fund rather than having to borrow it, as we did in 2022 and we will in 2023 for those two engine replacements. So the more money that we can get in the capital reserve fund in the next 8 to 10 years before those engines require replacement, the better that we'll be in a financial position when that time comes. Any questions on the power generation? All right, moving on to the last one. So there's only one reserve transfer that we're recommending for the new services that we've undertaken in 2023, and that's for regional transportation services. So no surprise here, much of the budgeted activity for regional transportation did not get underway in 2023. So because of those expense savings, we were anticipating a higher level of surplus. So you can see the revenue will be very close to budget, but because of the expense savings, we're about 135,000 under what we had budgeted. So the recommendation is to transfer, first to establish a operating reserve fund for regional transportation, and then transfer 120,000 from the operating fund into the operating reserve fund. What that would do is then leave a surplus in the operating fund of 12,000, and it allows the board to use the operating reserve fund of 120,000 in the future at their discretion for regional transportation services. So I just want to point out that not all of the funds have been included in these projections. And that was because there are no recommended reserve fund transfers related to those funds, because they are either expected to produce small deficits. So we've talked about, we expect small deficits for regional tourism as well as economic development. There could be a deficit with regard to cooperative and regional planning as well. And then the remaining ones are expected to have very small surpluses, so not enough to establish a reserve fund at this time. So no transfers are required for those funds. So in summary, staff is recommending 5 reserve fund transfers, and that the Finance Committee could forward those on to the board for their consideration. Turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
So any questions on the process? Of course, we don't do a motion at this level, and we don't vote on this particular issue, but do you think, are you confident that we have sufficient information for the board based on these reports and our discussion to make a recommendation to the board that they will accept the draft motion that I'm assuming Mary Kay will, or John will post to us for the meeting? That's really the question. Is there enough information so that you feel comfortable with our recommendation to support this?
I believe there is.
Yeah, all good here.
Yeah, same here.
Okay. Well, okay, so thank you, Mary Kay. If there are no further questions, we'll say Merry Christmas to one and all for now, and move on to an adjournment.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, just before we go, so we'll there will be a meeting called for Monday, a special meeting of the board in order to deal with these transfers so that we can tidy that up before December 31st. I don't think any of us want to be here on the 24th doing this, or the 25th, but we never know what our needs may be. But I just wanted to inform the members of that, and the chair has agreed, and everything will be put in place. So,
Okay.
What time will that be on Monday, John?
I believe, Kelly, we're looking at 10 a.m. on Monday. It'd be a short, usually they're a brief meeting, Director Fox, but it'll be at 10 a.m. on Monday morning.
Yep.
I'm not available on Monday.
Okay. Any others that's a major conflict for? The sad part about this time of the year, Mr. Chair, is that the great part and the sad part is that we'll probably never be able to pick a time where everybody's absolutely available unless we do it at about 11 o'clock at night or 6 a.m. in the morning. So
So now, no further questions, a motion to adjourn would be in order.
I'll make.
Seconder,
Second.
Seconded.
yes, we're gonna have a majority on this vote, so we're out of business.
Merry Christmas,
Have a great
everyone.
one,
If we don't-
everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Hopefully we will
Christmas,
get to
everyone.
see you. All the best.
Okay, Merry Christmas.